So finally, let's talk a bit about Sir Keir Starmer. He's delivered his New Year's speech this week. Another attempt to set out his vision, which most people have noticed he doesn't seem to have one that we could identify. Tom, I mean, one of the striking things he said was he talked a lot about the sort of cynicism of that people feel towards Westminster. And in particular, he talked about the importance of the vote. Mm-hmm. We've got a general election coming up and people should use their vote wisely for change, voting for him, presumably. But that's a little bit rich for Starmer, isn't it, to wax lyrically about the importance of democracy and the vote? Oh,
it is, definitely. I mean, I wrote on Spike this week that Starmer is to democracy and trust in politics what Rolf Harris is to child safeguarding. It's dreadful. This man spearheaded the campaign to overturn the Brexit vote. This man was one of the key kind of architects of that campaign to keep us in the European Union by any means necessary. He talked a lot earlier today when we're recording this in his speech about how people don't want Westminster just kind of arguing with itself all the time, as one of those people who were trying to, stop us from leaving the European Union. He was the one who created that whole environment of never stop talking about a question that the public, as far as they were concerned, was already solved and resolved. So it was incredibly rich. But I really do think Keir Starmer, I mean, he has this sort of halo of being Mr. Sensible. He might not be flashy or interesting or a visionary or whatever, but he's a good, honest person. He's genuinely one of the most dishonest politicians of his generation. I mean, he's quietly trying to pretend that he didn't back a second referendum. Yeah. Today, he claimed to be in the Q&A like a lifelong supporter of women's spaces because of his background in public service and so on, even though he spent the best part of the last 2 years arguing about how many penises women may or may not have.
One in 1,000.
1 in 1,000, yes. It was what he settled on in the end. But, he campaigned for the Labour leadership, suggesting that Corbyn's agenda was safe in his hands. And as soon as he got it, he started governing like a kind of born-again Blairite. So the capacity for him as a politician to say one thing and do another, to change what it is that he seems to believe based on what constituency he is talking to or what way the wind is blowing, I think is completely blows out the water Boris Johnson or any of these other kind of opportunists that we've had to deal with over recent years. And yet still he's seen as this sort of steady Eddie. He might not be great, but at least he's a good guy. I really don't see it, given his track record in recent years.
Definitely. And Rakib, I mean, there's a sort of danger in, electing someone this empty. I assume we are going to elect him. He is the presumed next Prime Minister. So we don't know where things are going to go. We don't know what ideas are going to sort of fill the void.
Well, the biggest idea that seems to be coming out of the Labour Party at the moment, if it was to return to power, is a new Race Equality Act, which speaks volumes in terms of the party still very much being enthralled to racial identity politics. I think there have been significant improvements which have been made, especially when it comes to tackling anti-Semitism from the Corbyn era. But I think the main issue is that many people are... It's very difficult to understand what Sir Keir Starmer stands for. And it's for the reasons that Tom has raised. There's a great deal of flip-flopping. He was the chief architect of the second referendum policy ahead of the 2019 general election. Then in the Labour leadership contest, I believe he actually campaigned for the retention of the freedom of movement. And then once he becomes leader, because he thinks there's political gain to be had by saying it, he says that the UK needs to wean itself off immigration dependency. So you don't know truly what he stands for. And I think more generally, I think people overall, they like to support politicians who they feel they have guiding principles. Like these are the key principles that will guide how they will govern the country. And I don't think Sir Keir Starmer falls into that at all. In his speech today, he talked a great deal about anti-establishment sentiment, cynicism towards politicians, how people are right to feel that way. But the truth is, he's contributed towards that. In my view, I think that at times he's been anything but honest. And I think in terms of political integrity, I think he could make serious improvements himself. The speech itself, I didn't find it to be particularly inspiring. I know there was a great deal of talk about how proud he is of the UK and what he wants to do for the country at large. But I think I I think he has to do a great deal of convincing. But in some ways, he might not have to, because the Conservatives are in such dire straits that may well be the primary reason why he will end up being Prime Minister. So it's not so much that it's a really positive vote for the Labour Party. It might just be more down to the fact that the people think that the Tories have had enough time in power and that they need to be removed.
And I suppose that's many of the problems we've just discussed about Keir Starmer you could equally apply to Rishi Sunak, certainly the sort of emptiness of the vision.
No, definitely. I think maybe it's just because I find Keir Starmer particularly irritating, just the way he speaks. I mean, it's like we've been subjected to so many of these vision speeches now, but I genuinely struggle to focus on what it is that he's saying, such as that kind of strange intonation, those sort of numbing nasal tones, the negative charisma. I genuinely have to watch things over and over again to try and work out what he's actually just said. Nevertheless, one thing that I think is particular about him, maybe, is the fact that we've been used to these kind of empty suit focus group politicians for a long time. But have we ever really seen one as hollow as this?
Yeah.
Like, really, if you don't like these principles, I've got some more. His whole political project seems to be bound up in the idea that he'd quite like to be Prime Minister. Like, he's like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a Blairite mid-ranking hack. Like, he's so unimpressive. And yet this man's going to be our next Prime Minister. And you're completely right. We have kind of gone back to the kind of factory reset of British politics, of this sort of technocratic managerialism. None of the big questions are up for debate. It's just about who is going to be the best sort of project manager of the country within very narrow ideological bounds. But Starmer just feels like the pinnacle of all that in the worst possible way. So I'm not looking forward to 4 years of his reign.